Anna, you're still muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeanette. Hi, everybody. I was just introducing myself. My name's Anna Potter. I'm in the Transportation Planning and Safety Division of the Public Works Department of the City of St. Paul. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight to learn a little bit more about the Minnesota Street Reconstruction Project. We're hoping to have some good discussion at the end of the presentation today, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to be here. What I'd like to talk through today is just reviewing the project scope, goals, and schedule, discuss what it is that we've heard so far from the public and key stakeholders in the corridor, talk about the design options that we've been considering so far, and then end with two high-level considerations for this group. There's some transit considerations that are going into the design, as well as parking considerations. I'll end with some next steps, and then we'll take your questions. So the Minnesota Street Project is a full reconstruction project, street reconstruction project in downtown. It is the full length of Minnesota Street between Kellogg on the south end of the corridor and 11th Street on the north end of the corridor. And the construction is going to occur in two different phases. The first phase is planned for 2023, and it is between Kellogg and 6th Street. And the second phase is planned for 2024, and it's between 6th Street and 11th Street. We have 6 goals that we've developed for the Minnesota Street Reconstruction Project. Those goals are to improve safety for all users, implement a bikeway connection, improve the transit user experience downtown, modernize the aging infrastructure, create a resilient, people-oriented corridor, and to support the evolving needs of downtown users. For many of you, all of the material I just went through is review, because we, in the summer, did what we called our first round of engagement. And in that round of engagement, we took a closer look at each of those goals that I just went through and some of the existing conditions in the corridor, got some feedback on what people want to see on Minnesota Street. And right now we're in this second round of engagement. And this is where we take that feedback that we heard and we try and come up with what the realm of possibilities might be for Minnesota Street based on what we've heard. Where we're going next is to refine the design. That will be the third round of engagement. And all of that will happen before we get into the nitty-gritty of the engineering design and our 2 phases of construction. So I just wanted to sort of ground people with where it is we're at in the process at this point. So I'll go quickly through what we've already heard, what we heard this summer from you all and from a variety of stakeholders in the corridor. To get that feedback on the goals and the existing conditions, we held a virtual open house. Similar to this one, we recorded a presentation and put it on our website. We had a survey, we did some in-person flyering of the corridor, we generated an email listserv. I hope many of you are on that list. And we had several meetings with people to talk about the project. We heard quite a bit. The presentation was viewed over 200 times and there were about as many surveys taken. There were 69 emails added to the email list. And at the time that this slide was created, we had 5 stakeholder meetings, but we've had many, many more since. I'm not going to go through everything we heard other than just thanking you all and the others that took our survey and gave us feedback because we got quite a bit. And we've synthesized our feedback into these 3 general bullets. The first is people are really passionate about this opportunity to improve Minnesota Street. There were a lot of calls for comprehensive changes. People called out things like greenways and transit malls. Some people called out more minor changes, site-specific tweaks, just small things to make it better. But at the end of the day, people were passionate about improving the corridor. There was a pretty strong desire for character and visual interest in the corridor, improving it from just being a lot of concrete, which is what you could find out there today. People suggested things like landscaping, trees, art, different materials. So we're translating that to mean how we use the sidewalk space is really critical on this corridor. And finally, we heard a lot of different mentions of traffic calming and right sizing the street, recognizing that it's a multimodal place with many different competing demands, and it's one street within the network of downtown. Some specifics of how we got to those three main takeaways. One question we asked was this question 6. Please tell us how important each mode is to you on Minnesota Street. And the answers to that question are shown on the screen. The darker the green box, the more votes that mode and ranking received. So the walking or using a mobility device was identified as most important to by many, many people. It was definitely the most common item selected, whereas taking transit was the next most important mode, and driving and bicycling tied for third in terms of most important. Notably, the driving and the bicycling mode, they both received votes on both ends of the spectrum. So they both received in the 20s of should not be accommodated, and in the 20 to 40 of is most important. So those two modes, very polarizing. People have very strong opinions about those, but it's mixed. There wasn't a clear universal choice by everybody. Getting dropped off was voted less important than the other modes. We also asked people what they thought of the goals that we had presented for the project, and all of the goals received several votes for it being very important. Most of them received a lot of votes for it being most important, very important, or somewhat important. You know, these dark blue, light blue, and gray bars are over half on all of the goals. So we feel good about keeping all of these goals moving forward. Notably, as I said before, the goal of implementing a bikeway connection, it was pretty polarizing, and it did have quite a few more not important and or disagree with this goal votes than the other goals. And so that just tells us that we have to think really hard about that goal and make sure that we're incorporating it in a smart way. If you want more details about what people heard or what people told us in the first phase of engagement, we do have a summary doc posted on our website. I would encourage you to go take a look at that. But for the sake of time today, I'm gonna move on to how we translated that feedback into some design options. And there were 3 main inputs that we use when we're coming up with different designs of the street. One of those inputs is all of the feedback I just went through, is what the public is saying, what users are saying. We want to make sure to incorporate that. The other 2 pieces of feedback that we want to make sure to incorporate are engineering input and making sure that it's a street that's going to function safely and within the full network of downtown. And then also policy input that's telling us to do certain things and to move the city in a certain direction. The challenging part here is some of these inputs are conflicting. This would be an easy process if all of those 3 things told us to do the same exact thing, but they don't. So what we've done here is we've tried to identify what are the things that we've heard that are deal breakers. What are our needs that Minnesota Street has to do? Let's make sure that our designs do that. And then let's also incorporate as many of the wants that we've heard of into those same designs and pick the one that has all the needs and as many of the wants as we can. So our proposed cross sections have all 4 of these needs met on the corridor. And this is something that, we've taken a first stab at it, but we're hoping to get feedback from you all on of these wants that we're listing or other wants that you've identified, what are most important to you? Because we're probably not going to be able, I know we're not going to be able to fit everything into the corridor. And so it's just going to be a balancing act of what's the most important want or two to fit in. So I'll just walk through the needs that are in each one of our potential design options. The first is an expanded pedestrian space and narrow crossings of the street. And this was something we heard from engagement and we heard from policy. The want associated with that would be to have some nice landscaping or furnishings to support that expanded pedestrian space. There's still a lot of things that we would need to work through if we were to include landscaping or furnishings, like who's going to maintain them. So that's definitely a want we want to carry forward, but continue to have conversations about. The next need that we've identified are 2 travel lanes. And this is something that we heard from my colleagues in the Public Works Department, and just recognizing the context of a downtown corridor is there are a lot of deliveries, there are a lot of people that make short trips here, a lot of trips, and so 2 travel lanes was kind of our baseline for how many travel lanes are appropriate here. To support those 2 travel lanes, the want that we've identified is to additionally include short-term on-street parking outside of those 2 travel lanes. The third need that we've identified is to minimize bus and bicycle conflicts. This was something we heard over and over again in our survey and first round of engagement feedback, was that people want a bicycle facility, but they also want to use transit, and it's uncomfortable when they're conflicting. And so there was some desire to keep them separate. And from an engineering perspective, we like that idea as well. So we're going to do what we can to minimize those conflicts. The want that we've heard is ideally in a downtown context, buses would stop in a travel lane. They wouldn't have to pull out of a travel lane in order to let users on and off. This is a more comfortable operation for transit riders. And again, in that downtown context where transit boarding and alightings are really high, we want to make that mode as comfortable as possible. The last need that we've identified is to have a separate bicycle space from vehicles. So this one primarily is a policy input. Minnesota Street is identified on our Capital City Bikeway network, but the design of what the connection looks like here is still very much in consideration. So we know that we have to include some sort of bicycle facility, and the question is just, what does it look like? So the want associated with that is, it'd be great if we could include an off-street bicycle facility, and it would be great if we could include a 2-way. And it just sort of depends which wants rise to the top in this conversation and in our survey results and through the other stakeholder meetings. So just to ground people on the existing use of the corridor, today there are 2 approximately 5-foot sidewalks on both sides of the street and 2 5-foot furnishing zones, resulting in about a 10-foot sidewalk space behind the curb. Between the curbs, we have 2 northbound travel lanes, 1 northbound, it's a mixture of a travel lane and a transit lane, so a lane that's used by buses, and that's curbside, and a curbside parking or loading zone. So on this graphic, you can see that these little bars here, those don't really mean anything specific on the graphic other than to just orient you when we look at our future options of where the existing curb is and how far that curb might move in that proposed option. So the first option that we've developed, keeping all of those needs in mind, is shown on the screen here. This option It increases our pedestrian space on the corridor. We have 2 7-foot sidewalks on either side. We're able to incorporate a 2-way bicycle facility, and that's what's shown in dark blue here. This option, it's compatible with our city policies that prioritize pedestrians, then bikes, then transit, and lastly, cars. And in this option, the on-street snowplow and removal conditions are pretty good because those snowplows can get right up to the curb all hours of the day. This option, it doesn't have any on-street parking in order to fit all of those features I just talked through, and to have a healthy furnishing zone on either side of the street. We weren't able to fit in any on-street parking. And as a result of that, loadings and deliveries would have to happen in one of the 2 travel lanes that we're showing here. This is certainly a change from today, based on the traffic volumes, which are at or below 4,000 pre-COVID. We think this is feasible from a traffic operations perspective, but it certainly is a change from the way the street is used today. The second option that we're considering still has those 2 7-foot sidewalks and 5-foot furnishing zones. What we're able to do here is we're also able to maintain some on-street parking and loading zone between intersections. When we are at intersections in this cross section, we think we'd be able to include a bump out in order to minimize the crossing distance. This one it does have a separate bicycle space from vehicles, but that bicycle space is on street. So we're showing a 6-foot on street, northbound only bicycle lane. Some of the challenges with this option is we have slightly narrower travel lanes in order to make all the other features fit. And that is workable, but not ideal for transit and for our maintenance vehicles. And this one-way, the other challenge with this option is we only have a one-way bicycle facility. Southbound bicycle users would have to use Jackson or Wabasha for their southbound portion of their trip. The third option that we're considering, it accommodates all modes with a one-way protected bicycle facility. So we still have the 7-foot walks. We have one side of the street could have a 5-foot furnishing zone. The other side of the street, the one that has the off-street bicycle facility, the furnishing zone would likely have to be a little bit more narrow and flanked by an even more narrow curb space or clear zone. In this option, we're still able to maintain a parking and or loading zone. And we have 2 northbound travel lanes. Some of the challenges with this one is this off-street one-way bicycle facility is a unique facility. And because it is at the sidewalk level instead of being at the street level, we would want to make sure that it's signed very clearly that it is a one-way facility. It might intuitively feel like a 2-way facility simply because it's at that sidewalk level. So that's something we would have to work through in the design process. Another challenge here is these features, while everybody is represented, all the different modes, we're all operating at our minimum dimensions. So it might feel kind of tight, whether you're driving, whether you're bicycling, whether you're parking, everybody's operating at their minimums. And we don't have as wide of a curbside furnishing zone on both sides of the street. So snow storage, depending on how much snow we get, could become an issue that is just something we would have to work through with our maintenance crews on how to make snow storage and clearing work here. So those are the three we landed on based on all the needs that I went through earlier and trying to fit as many as the wants. To get to those three, we went through quite a few other options. I'm not going to walk through each one of them. And this, what I'm showing on this slide, isn't even all the ones we thought through. This is sort of a summary of them. But I wanted to just sort of let people know that we did consider things like two-way operations. We did consider going down to one vehicle lane. We did consider things like a floating parking zone. And for a variety of reasons, we decided that wouldn't work for Minnesota Street. So we've kind of moved on from those. But if you have any questions about any of these options specifically or have any other ideas, I'd be happy to talk about that with you. But we still have three options on the table and we have to somehow narrow it down. So we created an evaluation matrix that went through each one of the modes and gave the mode a preferred, if you were a user of that mode, what did the survey takers and all the feedback that we've received so far, what did they say that mode wanted from a preferred standpoint? And what would that mode look like if it wasn't accommodated whatsoever? So we went through each one of the modes and I'm going to just open them all up here. We went through each one of the modes and tried to create a preferred, acceptable, inferior, and not accommodated ranking for each one. Now, for the sake of time today, and so that I don't bore everybody to tears, I don't think I'm going to go through each one of these, but if you have questions about them, I'd be happy to go through one of them with you. These slides will be posted on our webpage. So if this is something that you really want to dig into a little bit more, this information will be available for you to do that. Once we went through that exercise, here is how each one of the options and the existing conditions scored according to that previous ranking. And one thing to note here is we felt pretty good about this process because if you look at the existing conditions and you think about the way Minnesota Street operates and what's out there today, what this ranking is telling us is that it's working pretty well for people that are driving, for people that are making deliveries, and for the maintenance of the streets, but that it's not accommodating bicyclists and that there's some improvements that can be made as it relates to walking, taking transit, and parking. So we felt good about that sort of baseline, like did our evaluation actually work? So then if you look at each one of our options, option one is it's that one that had an off-street two-way bicycle facility. It results in pretty good scores for the walking mode, the transit mode, and the biking mode. But in order to do that, we had to give a little bit in driving, deliveries, parking, and maintenance. And then option 2 and 3 are, they score, if you're going to use that word, very similarly, but have some trade-offs in terms of option 2 is a little bit worse for bicyclists. It's an on-street facility that can be a little bit less comfortable for some users. Option 3 is a little bit more challenging for deliveries because everybody is at their minimums and we don't have as nice of a furnishing zone to transition between vehicles and pedestrian space. So there's trade-offs associated with each, and none of these options are the coup de grace or the obvious choice. So that was a ton of information to take in. And like I said, all of this information is going to be posted on our project website. What I would ask of you on this call or someone who is maybe listening to this online after the meeting is if you have a strong opinion about these three options, or if you have a strong opinion, maybe not about 1, 2, or 3, but about what features you want on the corridor. Like, I'd really like to have a certain type of bicycle facility, or I'd really like there to be able to be street trees. And so I want to make sure that that furnishing zone is wide enough and healthy enough to accommodate that and has some other sort of feature that's important to you. Go take our project survey. It's available now, and it will be available for a couple more weeks through October 21st. That survey is designed to try and get from you what your priorities are, walk you through each one of these cross sections, and try and get what your preferences and thoughts are about each. So we went through sort of that quantitative look at these. I really like these bubble charts and these evaluations. So we decided to do 2 of them instead of 1, and maybe we shouldn't have done that. But we thought, let's tie these options back to our goals and see how they rank. And we don't have that quantitative ranking or definition for each one of the goals, but in a qualitative way. With our first goal, improving safety for all users, we gave option 1 the highest score, option 2 the second highest score, and option 3 the lowest. Mainly because in option 2 and 3, it's an unfamiliar facility, and or they have minimum dimensions for multiple modes. And so that's just going to make it tighter and can generally lead to less safe conditions than when you have your preferred dimensions. In terms of the resiliency goal and the people-oriented goal, all of these are going to be a big improvement for Minnesota Street in terms of adding the potential for adding green space or making it more about people and less about vehicles or concrete. Ultimately, for any of these, though, really to make the corridor resilient and maintainable and sustainable, we need to come up with maintenance agreements and making sure that our design is something that we can keep looking good for years to come. In terms of modernizing the aging infrastructure, we didn't see a difference between these 3 options. All of these are going to bring our utilities up to modern standards. It's going to be a brand new street no matter which one of these options we pick. Supporting the evolving needs of downtown users. I'm going to wait until we hear from you all before we fill this one out. I think it's a little early for us to fill that one out. We'll do that once we get some feedback summarized. Improving the transit user experience. Metro Transit has expressed that they would really like to be curbside. It's definitely not, it's a want, not a need, but that would be their preference for this. And so for that reason, we gave option 1 a little bit higher of a score. They also want to have 12-foot lanes. And so that's only a reality in option 1. So the other 2 are a little bit less on that metric. And finally, the bikeway connection. Option 1 has a 2-way protected facility, and option 2 and 3, the facilities are either on street or only one direction, and so they score a little bit lower. So those were the 3 options. As we were developing those 3 options, there were 2 categories of considerations we just want you all to keep in mind or just be aware that are also sort of a part of the overall balancing of design that we're doing here. And the first is transit assumptions and transit considerations. Many of you have heard that Metro Transit is taking this opportunity with several of the north-south streets being reconstructed in downtown to take a step back and look at their transit network and make sure that the future network actually works and is the network that's best for the transit user. And we support them in doing that, and also want to make sure that once we're done with all of these projects, that the transit network works really well. So what we've assumed as the future transit network is what's shown on the screen here. And this is a network that operates very similarly to today. There are still two routes that are on Robert Street. Those are the routes 68 and 71, and that's exactly what happens today. All of the other north-south routes through downtown would be consolidated to Minnesota in the northbound direction and Cedar in the southbound direction. And that's what happens for most of the routes. There are a handful of routes on Wabasha today. The only change associated with what you see on the screen is just moving those Wabasha routes to Minnesota. The other option that Metro Transit is considering is moving all of the northbound and southbound bus service to Robert Street. This is a simpler network. It's more intuitive. You would know where to go, but it also means that there would be some users that would have to walk quite a bit farther to get to the bus stop compared to what they do today. So there's certainly trade-offs with these two networks, and we are working with Metro Transit to identify which one of these is the better network that's going to work best for transit users. But what we know is that no matter which one of those networks are selected, Minnesota Street would likely still need to serve transit, if for nothing else than just detours off of Robert Street periodically for some minor construction project or utility work or what have you. So our designs have to accommodate transit no matter which one of those networks are picked. And the question just becomes, if Robert Street is selected and all service is consolidated there, we just want to make sure that our cross-section, our design on Minnesota Street works for the users that are still using Minnesota Street in the best way possible. The final consideration I'd like to walk through with you all is parking. We have done a little bit of homework in what parking is available on or near Minnesota Street. So there are 65 spaces of metered parking on Minnesota Street today, and those are supported by 100 spaces on the adjacent side streets. And if you add up every single one of the spaces in the ramps adjacent to Minnesota Street that are publicly accessible, you get over 5,000 spaces. So I wanted to just sort of start the conversation by saying there is quite a bit of parking available in the area of Minnesota Street, and 1% of that parking is the actual metered spaces on Minnesota Street. Regardless, that 1% is a very, very important 1%. So we took it upon ourselves to go out to the corridor and see how utilized those really important 1% of spaces were. So this table that you can see on the screen is us counting the cars that were parked on Minnesota Street at different times of day in August and different types of day. And what we found was that the midday weekday period, the parking stalls on Minnesota Street are pretty well used, and particularly in the 5th to 7th Street, maybe even up to 9th Street area. Right in the middle of the day, yeah, these 5, 2, 9, and 6 stalls are being used. And that somewhat continues for, say, these 2 stalls between 5th and 6th Street on Minnesota, and these 3 stalls between 10th and 11th on Minnesota. They're pretty well used. Anytime you go out there and look, there's probably going to be a car parked there. The other stalls, the remainder of the 65, are really, they kind of drop off. If you're not in the middle of the day, we get a lot of like 0% to 50%. So the question for us is allocating some space in the right-of-way for a use for that on-street parking that may or may not, it varies block to block, be an all-day use? Is that something we want to do? In some cases, the answer to that question might be yes. And in some cases, the answer might be no. And that's a part of the conversation that we want to have today. And what we want to get from your feedback in the survey is knowing that it's busy for a short period of time. Is on-street parking something that we want to include in our design on Minnesota Street, or are there other things that we want to use the right-of-way for? I will just pause, make sure that I orient you to the graphic on the screen. The red blocks are the blocks on Minnesota Street that had those 100% or higher occupancies at some point in the day. So those are the blocks in particular that we're going to need to make a challenging decision on how does this 60 feet of right-of-way get used, knowing that parking is very well used on those red blocks in particular. Okay, I am almost done with the presentation. We're almost there, and thank you for bearing with me. So where we're at now is we have those 3 design concepts, and we need your feedback to tweak them, to pick between them, to make a hybrid of one of them. You know, that's what we thought one of these would work for Minnesota Street, but we want to hear what you think. So please go take our survey and let us know what you think. We're going to take your feedback plus policy and engineering to start to hone in on one design for Minnesota Street. So again, we're in that second round. We're trying to narrow our design options down to 1. We're not necessarily going to pick one of the 3. Like I said, it might be a hybrid or it might be a completely different option, but those are the 3 that we've landed on so far. What we're going to do next is incorporate your feedback, try to get to one cross-section, continue to have stakeholder meetings and conversations. We'll hold a 3rd virtual open house and bring a recommended design back to you all, get feedback on that one. And then the goal is early of next year to request approval from City Council on that concept design after hearing feedback from this group one more time. Once we get that approval on the concept design next year is when the final design process will start, followed by the 2 phases of construction in 23 and 24. So before I open it up for questions, the 3 things you can do today, if you want to give feedback and you want to stay informed, go take our survey. You can find it at stpaul.gov/Minnesota Street. If you don't want to take the survey, but you just want to sign up for email updates about construction, you can do that. Look for the blue bar at the project website. And if neither of those 2 things work for you, just go ahead and contact me and we'll figure out a different way to get your feedback. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Thanks for being here again, everybody.
And if you have a question, feel free and put it in the chat or use the raise hand feature. Or I think we have a small enough group. If you want to just unmute yourself and ask, we could do that too. All right, Anna, looks like we do have a question in the chat. So I'll just read it so everyone can hear it in case you're not seeing that chat. Do all 3 design concepts have the same implementation date? In other words, if we go with option 1, do we have to wait until 2025 with some interim treatment like 9th and 10th, but option 2 or 3 might be 2023?
Nope, they all have the same implementation date. The corridor is funded for a full reconstruction between Kellogg and 11th. So the design can be whatever the design wants to be for that full extent. So No, it does not change the date. That's a great question, though.
And what about additional bike parking? Is that an option, or what would that?
Yeah, that would certainly be something that we could continue to talk about, of how we use the furnishing zone. Maybe what I'll do is I'll go back to a slide that has our options.
Can I clarify my question a little?
Sure.
I wanted to know what it meant. Like, I see where it's going to be on the width of the road, but like, what are we talking about here? Like poles? I'm not from a city that had a lot of bike parking, so what does that mean exactly?
We definitely haven't gotten to that stage of design yet, of picking what the specifications of the exact bicycle parking would look like. But it would be, if we were to include bike parking, it would be something that's bolted into the ground most likely, and like a permanent fixture that then you could place your bike against and connect with a locked, like U-lock or something. I know that we have done a lot of work recently to figure out what type of bicycle parking we in Public Works can maintain. And so if we were to pick bike parking, we would pick that same design, I'm fairly certain. But I actually don't know the detail of what that parking looks like. Ruben, do you have a quick way to explain that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ruben Collins, and work for the City of St. Paul Department of Public Works. We have a couple of standard designs of bike parking that we use. Generally, they're either referred to as a hoop style or a hitch style. Those are the two common styles that you see around the City of St. Paul. So likely we would select one of those two styles for inclusion on this corridor.
Thank you.
And if anyone has a question, feel free and unmute yourself, raise your hand, or type it in the chat.
I do have one more comment about the bus routes, or at least a question about the bus routes. Maybe it's more of a comment. I think having all of the buses go the same, or all of the bus stops be along the same road, might actually be a bad idea, because then it's too dense, and aside from them being in the same place at the same time, now I would think a more sparse placement of the bus stops would mean that it would get more coverage.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's kind of the challenge, right? Is you want to balance frequency versus coverage. And if we have the network that's shown on the screen, you get better coverage, where people who maybe are trying to go to Rice Park or other destinations on the west side of downtown don't have to walk quite as far to get to their bus. Compared to if we consolidate all the services to Robert Street, as would be what's shown here on the screen, you'd get a lot more frequency of buses. So theoretically, if you just wanted to go from one side of downtown to the other, you don't have to wait very long. You can get on any of the buses and just go. But it is sort of asking people to walk further. And there's the question of, are we concentrating too many bus users in one place? Is it going to get too crowded at the bus stops that are all serving a large number of routes? Yeah, I think that's probably some of the main hesitancies that we have with this route that's shown. So I think you bring up a really good point.
We'll see if there's any final questions. Thanks everyone for staying on.
And there was a lot of material in this presentation. So yes, thank you for staying on. You know, this is my job. I think about this all the time, so I kind of run through it quickly. But if there's something that you just need a little bit more time to digest, we're going to post this presentation, the recording, and the slides themselves on our website. And you can take the time you need to kind of think about it. And then if you have feedback, either go ahead and go take that survey, or you can just call or email me. You know, it's not like today is the last day that you can give feedback.
I'm not seeing any questions at this time. So we'll give folks another minute, but I'm going to say not hearing questions. Feel free and wrap up, Anna.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you going and taking that survey. We'll come back out for another open house in this winter when we think we've narrowed it down to one. I appreciate it.